Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan Ennis. It's a Ukraine War Frontline update for the 7th of March 2024. Let's get straight to where we normally start, which is the northeastern sector. By the way, if you don't know what the lines on my map mean, pause the video and check out the key. You can see that, yet again, not a lot going on in Krinky and the southern front lines there. So we will go to the North Kupiansk area, Kupiansk to Svatova to Kremina, Axis up here in the northeast. And you can see that Andrew Perpetua has some increases in Russian territory north, interestingly, of Liman Pershi, up along the Oskil River on the Robivka, Tavelzhanka, in that kind of area, although it's not up to, or it's not over the river. So this is to say that Russians control more substantively areas of Dorichna here. But yeah, not a move across the river. I'm amazed that there would be any grey zone this side of the river, to be perfectly honest. I would have thought by now the Russians would have pushed the Ukrainians right up into the river, but obviously not. They're still fighting. There's still grey zone around there, according to Andrew Perpetua, not according to the other two mappers who agree. So Deep State Map and Syriac Map agree that the Russians control everything up to the river. Yeah, it would amaze me if there is still grey zone around here, but that's what Andrew thinks, and I'm sure he's got good reason for that. It's difficult for the Russians in this area, not least because of the river. I don't know that tells us anything. There are certain areas of this river where the Russians will really struggle because there are bluffs just around here for them to be able to get across. Yeah, that's better. So as you can see there, much higher ground on the other side of the river. It would be very difficult for the Russians to cross there. Certain areas further up north here where you have settlements on the river's edge, it's going to be somewhat easier. Bridge there, but that will no longer be standing for sure. But yes, so it could be that the Russians try something in that area at some point. I don't know. Not really heard much the other side of the Oskil River. It's all about Sinkivka going towards Kupiansk down here. And as for this area over in Orliansky, and up towards Persho-Travnevi, the Russians making some small gains there, or at least there's been some evidence to suggest they're further forward than Andrew had previously thought. It's unlikely that they're pushing there right now. They could be, but it's more likely it's putting those lines in line with the other mappers in that area. So not so much that the Russians are attacking for either of those. It could be just that they are. There's just evidence that's come to light for Andrew to move his mapping in that way, Andrew Perpetua. As we can see, no changes anywhere else to the mappers until we can go and come past Bakhmut all the way down to Avdiivka area. But before we go there, let's drop into the Institute for the Study of War that says of that northeastern sector, Ukrainian Kharkiv Oblast military administration head has stated that Russian forces have concentrated roughly 100,000 personnel in the Kupiansk and Liman directions, and that roughly 40,000 of those personnel are combat personnel. So this is yet again what we have heard a gazillion times, that 100,000 people up in this area, 40,000, being quite explicit there, are combat personnel. So the Russians could throw 40,000 people at various places along this front line, or indeed just one place, and massively overwhelm it. But that doesn't seem to happen. So I'm not sure about the accuracy of those claims, or this is an area where there's a lot of training. So Luhansk Oblast is where the Russians train a lot of their soldiers. So it could be that there are 40,000 combat personnel there, but they're actually mainly those that have just been mobilized into the army, forced conscription, and then thrown into some training establishments. And it's not, technically they are combat personnel, but they're not combat ready, and it's not people that the Russians could throw straight onto the frontline areas in that northeastern sector. So these troops might then be moved off down to other areas of the front line to replenish lost troops. So yeah, I never know quite what to make about those expansive claims of large numbers of Russian troops in that Luhansk region. Right, okay. We come down, as I said, past Bakhmut, where there doesn't seem to be any movement today, and we are moving on to. We're going to talk about some stuff just after we finish the mapping updates. There's stuff that's pertinent to the mapping that's sort of come out today. That is in the Robotin area, so we get there later. Right, okay. Avdiivka, as you can see, there's been a couple of days of stasis here. Well, there's a little bit of a movement for the Russians just north of Berdichi. I don't think it's hugely significant. It's just Andrew aligning his mapping with the other mappers just in that area. Berdichi still not taken by the Russians certainly as according to Andrew. The other two mappers, Russians only just into that settlement. As far as Orlivka is concerned, Surat Map's still asserting that the Russians control most of Orlivka. Deep State Map, maybe half of Orlivka, and Andrew Perpetua, none of Orlivka, and that it's probably just a grey zone, although the Russians seem to have pushed right up to the river, as according to both Deep State Map and Surat maps today, and that's really significant because this is where the Ukrainian defensive line is going to be sitting. There's some topography for the Russians to deal with here. They've got to cross, albeit a small river here. Actually, that's far more significant. That's the pond. But otherwise, I don't know how big the river is they have to cross, but they had to get their equipment across there, and then they have to deal with higher ground here. So the Ukrainians are looking down on the Russians from this area. Just zoom back out. So as you follow the river down from Berdichi, down here comes around to Umanska. It is higher ground to the west of the river. So this is all higher ground, and the Russians are moving on the flat ground up to the river. So it'll be interesting to see what happens here if the Russians really have got to that point, what they will try and do. Now, that is the side of this kind of reservoir lake, and it will be unsurprising that the Ukrainians won't want to be pushed back against that lake. Yeah, it doesn't surprise me that the Russians will have made it to that point. But where they go from there is going to be interesting to see. As we go to the Institute for the Study of War concerning this area, we have them saying one Russian mill blogger claimed that Russian forces control about half of Tonyenka and Pervomaisky and most of Orlivka. So that's Orlivka, most of Orlivka, according to a Russian mill blogger. Half of Tonyenki, and this is where the Russians have apparently been pushed back, but controlling half of it is about where Surat Maps has them. Andrew Perpetua and Deep State Map has the Russians not controlling any of Tonyenka, really, not meaningfully. And as we see Pervomaisky, I mean, it depends where you call Pervomaisky finishing and ending. It seems to be that Pisky turns to Pervomaisky down at this road junction at the bottom here. So the Russians have been moving slowly up. They're very thin and now completely destroyed Pervomaisky. It's completely flattened, really. And then, yeah, they are continuing moving up along there. But also, according to Surat Maps, having some success just around the reservoir areas, or these kind of lake ponds, whatever you want to call them, just there too. So Russians succeeding there, as according to Surat Maps. Russian mill bloggers also claim that Russian forces control the eastern half of Berdichi. And again, that's what we talked about up here. Exactly that, according to really Surat Maps. So eastern half, or according to Surat Maps, the very eastern area of Berdichi, most of it is under Ukrainian control, or grey zone more likely, as according to Surat Maps there. Another Russian mill blogger claimed that Russian electronic warfare systems are interfering with Russian drone operations near Lastochkerna, something else that I reported to you the other day, and claimed that Russian forces need to create drone and electronic warfare coordination centers. The mill blogger also claimed that Russian assaults have slowed down west of Avdiivka as retreating Ukrainian forces consolidate on new defensive lines. The mill blogger claimed that increasing degradation of Russian forces in the area is exposing issues with planning and coordination between Russian military command and frontline units. The Ukrainian Tavrisk Group of Forces press service reported that Ukrainian forces have established a second line of defensive fortifications in the Avdiivka direction, equipped with asphalt support points for higher and more secure trench walls, anti-tank trenches, concrete bunkers, Dragon's Teeth, and other fortifications. Ukrainian officials reported that Ukrainian forces have also equipped fortifications with unspecified protection against Russian shelling and drone strikes. So it does appear that the Ukrainians are doing a better job of digging in now. Some people were wondering why it had taken them so long to get defensive fortifications built around here, but maybe they've got to the point where actually they can successfully rebuff the Russian advances. We shall see. So it's certainly slowed down to some extent, although there's a little bit of movement today. It's not like it was over the last couple of weeks. The last couple of days, I think, have been good for Ukraine there. Then, as we come down to Mariinka, we can see some slight rejigs there. Ukrainian gaining into tree lines, maybe pushing the Russians back north of Mariinka. That is around the Krasnohorivka, towards Krasnohorivka. Andrew Perpetua has the Russians pushing westwards, more like aligning to the other mappers there. So rather than the Russians gaining the last 24 hours, it's more that he's found evidence to support what Surat maps and Deep State maps had previously. So if we go to the ISW in this area, geolocated footage published on March 6th indicates that Russian forces recently marginally advanced in Heyorivka. We'll go and find that on the map again. So that is in this area. Let's get a geolocation for that. Referring to NOAA Reports' video that's shared here about the Ukrainian Air Assault Brigade's World Division unit sharing footage of targeting Russian infantry with FPV drones. I can't show you that, but I can take the geolocation of the Russian infantry being struck here. And of course, you have the same old question as that: if there are Russian infantry there and they're being hammered by drones, do they actually control that? Oops, that isn't. Oh, no, that's not the geolocation. That's a Robotina geolocation. We'll come to that in a second. Nonetheless, there is geolocation. I just haven't got it ready to suggest that the Russians have gained in Herivka direction. So it'll be somewhere around there. Right, okay, moving on to Robotina, where there are no changes. But we do have the claims from yesterday of Surat maps showing or claiming that the Russians have made significant gains in this area to the west of Verbove and taken back the last area of the Surovikin fortifications there, that tank trench that the Russians have been wanting to take back of the Ukrainians as the last area of the Surovikin line that Ukrainians were holding on to. So Surat Maps has them in control of that. Andrew Perpetua, Deep State Map, not yet. But there is geolocated evidence that the Russians are as far as here, and that will be exactly why Surat Maps has the Russian control at that point. As I always say, just because the troops are there doesn't mean they control it. So in this case, they are being... Oops, I don't know what that random post is there for. They are being hammered by first-person view drones. Do they control that, or have they just advanced there and got killed by FPV drones? I would probably say the latter, and that's why Andrew Perpetua generally doesn't change his mapping evidence like that. He needs to see consolidated evidence that the Ukrainians have, that the Russians in this case have, bedded down there and have a defensive position there rather than just troops walking through and getting hammered. That would almost certainly be a grey zone on that evidence, I would suggest. Right, that is that for the frontline update. There's not much to say of that southern front line, not much to say about Krinky. The last part is just that there is small amounts of, I've gone through that, small amounts of engagements going on there. Russian mill bloggers claim that Russian forces intensified shelling and loitering munition strikes on Ukrainian positions in the Kherson direction. Right, now I'm just going to do a little bit of an overview with regard, I don't know if overview is the right word. So today I keep talking about how Emmanuel Macron is positioning himself as the kind of rallying leader in Europe, right? Whether you like him or not, or whether you think that's a good idea or not, or whatever. I personally think there absolutely needs to be someone. He's the right person because France is a big country. There's no one else that's willing to do it. And that's also probably the right country within Europe to do that as well, given its very strong industrial military complex and the fact it's not one of these that's right on a front line and therefore being biased maybe by its own geographical position and threat from Russia coming from the east. Okay. So Macron is positioning himself, and he's also called together people today in a video conferencing meeting. I think you've got Moldovan leaders also possibly in France. He's saying that we're going to talk about how we can get support for Ukraine strengthened, as well as concentrating on what we need to do as far as Europe's concerned. I believe it's probably just Europe with regard to supporting Moldova. Okay, so Le Monde then today says Macron hopes to convince the French of the seriousness of the situation. This is really, really important, by the way, guys. I keep harping on about this because actually it's massively significant. What you've got you've got Europe waking up to the threat of Russia, and this is a reflection of that. The French president received the predecessors at the Elysee Palace and wanted to consult and gather the opinions of his colleagues about the war in Ukraine and the threatening war between Russia and NATO. Okay, so he's trying to convince the French population. He's trying to convince other leaders. He's recently got all the French leaders from different political parties and to gather around him to discuss with them the seriousness of the situation. Now, Medvedev has then come back today, the Russian prime minister, to say if Macron says that there are no more red lines in supporting Ukraine, which is big for Macron, say we need to talk about troops on the ground, we need to talk about this, we need to talk about that. Then Russia no longer has red lines in relation to France. So this is escalatory, or at least the rhetoric is escalating, and that's obviously quite serious. It's completely unsurprising. It's what Russia do an awful lot of, a lot of rhetoric, a lot of hot air about red lines and about no red lines and oh my goodness, nuclear this, nuclear that, and then the end result is no change. So I'm particularly worried. But what Shashank Joshi says in analysing this is insanely important. Right. I am curious what DRM, French military intelligence, is telling Macron about the risks of a Russian breakthrough. Western officials played down the idea in recent weeks, citing limitations on Russian ammunition and leadership. Experts have been more circumspect, pointing to poor Ukrainian defences. So we have this idea, and going back to the ISW talking about, or people that the ISW references talking about, massive forces amassing in Luhansk area towards Liman direction, Kupiansk direction, 40,000 combat troops, 100,000 personnel in all. And then we have the Russians, really pushing in Avdiivka, Novomykhailivka, Mariinka, and then trying to prod and probe in all these places. Then my comeback has been, I don't think the Russians actually have all that much left in the tank, but if they can keep sustaining this going forward and keep throwing personnel and equipment into, they might not be super prepared, trained, they might not want to be there, they might be nicked from other countries, whatever it is that Russia is doing to get people and equipment there, they're just about doing it, and they are causing Ukraine to possibly be on their knees, especially given the lack of artillery ammunition and equipment due to what's gone on in Congress, etc., etc. Okay, so my opinion hasn't changed actually about all of this rhetoric that's been talked about and what Shashank Joshi is saying, and I'll continue going through that in a second, just confirms my point that I said the other day, which is that both countries are on their knees. And I still think that. I think Russia is just about able to continue pushing fairly significantly because they're throwing everything in the kitchen sink at this. Ukraine is just holding on tenuously, able to massively attrit the Russians still. The Russians are making huge losses, but the Ukrainians are making, relative to the size of their army and what they can draw from, fairly huge losses as well. Although I do think the Ukrainians can draw an awful lot more of the population. I was listening to the latest piece on people who are evading being mobilized, being called up, right? The evading going onto the streets to be recruited. And I think there's an awful lot of Ukrainians who are sitting at home. It's not that they don't support their nation. It's not they don't support their troops in an abstract sense, but there's an awful lot of people just not wanting to go outside because they're afraid of being mobilized. They don't want to be sent to the front line. So there's probably quite a few people that can be recruited, and so anyway, that's a whole other conversation. But I think both sides are on their knees. However, it has been really tough for the Ukrainians. People have massive expectations for the Ukrainian counteroffensive, and it didn't quite pan out in the way people were expecting. And I think this has filtered through to Macron and other people in Europe, so that they've got to this realization that, holy crap, we need to really help the Ukrainians, which is why Olaf Scholz has been piling resources other than tourists, and it's all a bit controversial with tourists, but outside of tourists, Germany's been massively stepping up, like hugely stepping up, and we must remember that. We must not get sidetracked by tourists. The Germans are doing an awful lot. In fact, they just pumped a triple figure million euros into the artillery fund to tip it over the edge. So that's great. The Germans are doing a lot. France is now stepping up. Macron's leading. We've got the Baltics. We've got Denmark. We've got the Scandinavian nations. UK. Interestingly, people are starting to wake up to the UK not giving as much as possibly people think. I often talk about as a percentage of GDP, and I pointed out very explicitly to you the other day that as a percentage of GDP, the UK well down the list. Like the US is like 31st, the UK is like 20 something, and all the other European nations are ahead of us. We've upped it to £2.5 million this year. Pounds this year. But actually, that is not a lot compared to what we could give. Fun fact, I think in order to try and bribe people to vote for them, the Conservative government, who are tanking in the polls at the moment, have just done a budget, and the budget is giving away 14 billion quid's worth of stuff or something like that, with 2p in a pound off national insurance contributions. Like, just pointless stuff that's essentially... It is pointless because they're giving money away because they've realised that they've got nothing else to attract people to vote for them. So they're basically bribing the electorate, which is fairly normal. That's what political parties do. But this is like trying to hit middle-income people and above. There's stuff to do with landlords, all this stuff to get the kind of people who normally vote for them to definitely try and vote for them. Now, that just annoys me because I'm like, you're going to lose the election. You're giving £14 billion away that you don't need to give away to the UK population. Yeah, times are tough, but you're giving it away to the wrong people if you are going to give it away. Okay, that 14 billion quid, if it is that, I don't know, different figures, whatever, X amount of money, like, existential crisis in Europe, yeah, you could reinvigorate your own industrial base by supporting UK defence manufacturers and getting some stuff and making sure our armed forces are prepared, and then shipping that off to a bunch off to Ukraine. But instead, no, you're doing all this frivolous stuff with trying to bribe people to vote for you, and it's stupid. So it's interesting. Like Ukraine the Latest, finally, as a Daily Telegraph podcast, which is very good otherwise, but it's very much not jingoistic. It's very much pro-Britain because of the positioning it has, like politically speaking, but it's all like it's always anti-EU, and it slags off the EU. It has done, and I've called them out on it publicly before. But finally, the other day, for the first time, one of their reporters said, "Yeah, I was looking at stats, and it turns out that if I compare all these 10 European countries for how much money's been spent on Ukraine, UK at the bottom of the list. We are 10th out of the 10 that I looked at." Yeah, no shit, mate. Like, you know, when you look at it as a percentage of GDP, when you actually compare us to what Europe is doing, like fairly, then we ain't great. Like, we have done great stuff, Storm Shadows and Challenger 2s, etc., etc. I just think we could all do more, and I don't think UK gets a free pass. Now, that's not to say that we haven't been great in rhetorically in this and that and with those bits of kit. Right. So, to go back to this issue here, Macron today produced maps of a possible Russian breakthrough towards Kiev or Odessa, which could oblige the West to act to prevent a Russian victory in Ukraine. In talks with French opposition leaders, Macron said there should be no more red lines on French involvement in conflict. So this is what Medvedev was referring back to. And I'm going to go back to that in a second. I just want to finish what Shashin Joshi was saying. From French briefings in Munich, though I'm also told they did not rule out the prospect of more serious setbacks, the French talked down suggestions that Ukrainian morale, supply lines and logistics are so stretched that there may be a collapse this summer. The most likely future this year is stalemate and a long war, Paris believes. Okay, and that came from The Guardian, but Shashant Joshi is then tying that back to what's being said here. Emmanuel Macron summoned leaders of all French parliamentary parties the other day, as I talked about, to talks at Elysee to explain the controversial remarks last week in which he said the deployment of Western troops in Ukraine should no longer be excluded. Participants in the meeting said Macron had explained his theory of strategic ambivalence, keeping Moscow guessing. Absolutely, like, strategic ambiguity is such an important thing. Like, if you start being too explicit about what you can and can't do, what you will and won't do, then you are telegraphing stuff to the opposition and they can plan for that. If you say, who knows what might happen, we could send troops, we might not, who knows, depends how we feel, then it keeps the other side guessing. Participants in the meeting said keeping Moscow guessing. Right. Since Vladimir Putin clearly knew no limits, he said, the West had been handing him an advantage by fixing or interiorizing limits of its own. This is absolutely necessary for Macron to be saying this and for this line of thinking to be prevalent with the Allies. But opposition leaders of the far right, that is, Marine Le Pen, unfortunately, and her France rally, which is gaining more and more popularity. Right and left said they had been left worried and unconvinced by Macron's approach, which has also been rejected by the US, UK, Germany, and several other NATO countries. I, for one, agree with his approach. And I think you should too. I'm not here to just try and convince you, to my opinion, just because it's my opinion. But actually, as I said before, we shouldn't, exactly what Macron said, we shouldn't be limiting ourselves, and we should be open to the possibility of sending non-combat troops and so on and so forth. Jordan Bardella, the president and de facto number 2 of Marine Le Pen's far-right Rassemblement National, France rally, or National Rally, said threatening to send French soldiers to fight a nuclear power like Russia is irresponsible and extremely dangerous for world peace. Of course, they're going to say that. They have links to Russia. Now, someone tried to call me out on that the other day, a French person who I couldn't tell whether they were a Russian troll or a French person. And I had to just spend a lot of time going through, here's all the evidence. There's a whole heap of evidence to show the connections between her party and her, indeed, and Putin and Russia. So go and deal with it. Today's meeting was a prelude to a 2-day parliamentary debate next week to discuss a 10-year defence pact signed by Macron and the Ukrainian President Zelensky last month. Macron told French journalists on Wednesday that he hoped this debate would make it clear which political forces in France supported Ukraine and which supported Russia. Elysee officials denied domestic politics in June. EU elections have influenced Macron's new rhetoric on Ukraine. They say he is driven by the difficult situation on the front line, Navalny's murder, and Kremlin talk of a possible attempt of his own life when he visits Kiev later this month. Macron is, however, evidently hoping the new rhetoric will embarrass Le Pen, who had a long history of Putin worship. Absolutely true. If you actually look at what she said, Marine Le Pen, just in the same way you need to go and look at what Trump says about Putin, they are very similar. The government spokeswoman, Prisa Thévenot, says it is quite evident that Le Pen, unlike Macron, is not committed to Russia's defeat. Right, so then why am I saying all this? Because part of this is to do with whether the French intel is that the Ukrainians are in trouble on the front line, and whether the Russians are in a position to make a serious breakthrough in summer. I mean, it's impossible for them to reach Odessa. I'm absolutely certain of that. Mykolaiv too. I don't think it's realistically going to happen. But there is this thinking out there, and it appears that Macron has some kind of much more realistic understanding of what's going on. I've said previously that Ukraine might well have been the victims of their own success, so that people didn't expedite help to Ukraine in the early part of the war. Oh, Ukraine doing really well. Oh, Russia doing really badly. Aren't Russia crap? Aren't Ukraine amazing? And then lo and behold, we kind of drib and drab feed Ukraine, and then it gets to the end of the counteroffensive. It's like, oh, right, Ukraine are in trouble now. Oh, quickly, let's go and build stuff. And people are complaining about Europe not being ready and not having done stuff, but that's because I don't think we were scared early enough, right? And that's why we're at the moment. Anyway, I know that's not a lot of frontline analysis, but I think it's really important to understand that I think a major player in Europe, Emmanuel Macron, is getting intelligence to suggest things are really desperately challenging for the Ukrainians, and that things could be going well for the Russians, and they could make a major breakthrough in the summer. I actually don't, as I said, don't think that they will or can. But let me know what you think with regard to all of those dynamics. That's enough from me. Take care. Speak soon.